This is Conor Lennon from UN News. When a group linked to the ISIL terror organisation claimed responsibility for the armed attack on the Crocus City Hall near Moscow on the 22nd of March, in which at least 137 people were killed, there was speculation that one of the reasons was Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war, which is believed to have been instrumental in keeping President Bashar al-Assad in power. This was a reminder of the ongoing impact of the war, which has now dragged on for more than 12 years and rarely makes headlines, even though it continues to have a devastating impact on the civilian population. In early March, the United Nations Syria Commission of Inquiry released a report which detailed an escalation of fighting, attacks on civilians and infrastructure that could amount to war crimes, and a humanitarian crisis. 90% of the Syrian population is living in poverty. Hanny Megally is the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at New York University's Centre on International Cooperation, and he's been a member of the Commission since 2017, and he's here with me in the studios in New York. Hello, Mr. Megally. Thank you for coming in today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
And we're speaking just days after that attack on Crocus City Hall, just outside Moscow. And the group claiming responsibility, which is an offshoot of ISIL, has reportedly cited Russia's involvement in the Syrian war as a justification for this attack. First of all, do you think that is plausible and likely? And also, give us an up-to-date on how active Russia is in Syria right now.
Russia is certainly very active in Syria. They came in, 6 years after the conflict started, essentially at the invitation of the government in Damascus, and without Russia's intervention, I don't think the government would have survived. I don't think Bashar al-Assad would have survived. Unfortunately, the Russians were willing to put boots on the ground where others were not, and by doing that, they allowed the state to regain control over most of the country. Russia has, a huge Air Force base and a few other bases on the ground. They're constantly flying over and bombing where armed groups are located, armed groups fighting against the government in Damascus. So they did tip the balance in favor of the survival of the government. Whether that can be a justification that people can use for the attack, I think we would always say, of course, nothing can justify an attack like this. But you can see in Syria that the Islamic State is growing in force in the last few years. This year alone, there have been more than 35 attacks, and we're in March. The whole of last year, I think, were less than 50. So, unfortunately, as the country is crumbling after 13 years of conflict, some of those that we thought were defeated back in the days are coming back, and none of the issues that have caused the conflict have been dealt with, none of the root causes.
Just going back to ISIL, this is, 5 years after they lost their last actual territorial hold on the country, but you're saying they're still growing in strength.
They are growing in strength, and they're responsible for, quite dramatic attacks in Syria now that are, taking their toll on the military, and surprising everyone with their. There was an attack a couple of years ago on a prison in the northeast, where the Kurdish authorities were holding alleged fighters and those associated with the Islamic State, and it was, quite a well-planned attack. It took a week to regain control over the prison. Many escaped. And sadly, of course, hundreds got killed in the process.
What struck me also about your report is not just the amount of violence that there currently is, but the amount of foreign activity there is. Your report details 6 foreign armies in Syria. Can you take us through what those armies are?
Right. Sadly, with the conflict in Syria, you've seen other parties come into the area. You have the Russians there supporting the government. You have Iran there also at the invitation of the government supporting it. You have the United States and a coalition with the United States that are in the northeast. that are shoring up, in essence, an autonomous Kurdish authority there. You have Turkey in the northwest also supporting, I should say Turkey in the northwest also supporting armed opposition groups. You have Israel now bombing even more since the Gaza conflict began, a huge increase in bombings, including Damascus, including Aleppo, including the airports, as they go after what they perceive to be mainly pro-Iranian forces on the ground. And you have Jordan most recently going after drug smugglers right in the south. At least 2 aerial bombardments that Jordan seems to have been responsible for, although they've not confirmed it themselves.
From what you're saying, it sounds as if Syria has become the location for a series of overlapping proxy wars. Is that a fair characterization?
I think it is. And the sad thing is that these other states came into Syria either to support the state, the government in Damascus, or to support the armed opposition, and to arm and support the opposition in that sort of way, which has prolonged, of course, the conflict both ways. Both are getting arms and supplies from outside and support. And so, in essence, for those states, Syria has become a place where they can test out weapons. They can use old weapons that they no longer need to keep. And they can hit each other within Syria, whereas if it would be taken more seriously if they were doing it outside.
It avoids potential escalation to
Exactly,
wider conflict.
sadly, for the Syrian people.
But your report also contends that Gaza has been escalating tensions and it is elevating the risk of the conflict spreading further.
Yes, what we've noticed, since October, is instead of, as had been the case maybe for the last couple of years, the state has regained control over large parts of the country. There's a bit of a stalemate in the northeast and the northwest where you see them hitting at each other, but really very little progress, so a little bit of a stalemate. And maybe people are beginning to think there'll be a lull in the actual conflict. What we've seen in the last 6 months is a big escalation. I described earlier what happened after the Homs Academy, but we're also seeing Turkey going after what they consider to be PKK elements inside Syria.
Kurdish fighters.
Yeah, after the attack that had happened in Ankara. And they're hitting what we consider to be civilian objects, like electricity stations, water stations, etc., that are essential for the survival of the civilian population. And in one attack, they cut out, a power station, which then cut the water because of the pumps to more than 1 million for days, if not more than a week. We're seeing skirmishes between the groups themselves, whether in the Kurdish-controlled areas with Arab tribes, whether where the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is in control in Idlib, with those that are beginning to feel maybe they should be moving the leadership there and bringing others in. We're seeing it also in the north with the groups that are being supported by Turkey, beginning to fight amongst themselves. And then you go to the south and we're seeing unrest increasing in Sueda, where the government so far has, I think, tried to be a bit more in control in terms of excessive use of force. But sadly, we've seen at least one incident where someone got shot and that sort of incited a bit more violence.
Well, let's talk a bit more about the effect on the civilian population.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the largest displacement crisis in the world, 13 million Syrians having to leave their homes. So how bad is it?
It's pretty bad because if you consider 13 years of conflict and aerial bombardments, and before that barrel bomb bombardments, and before that, fighting on the ground, much of the infrastructure in the country has been destroyed. And it's not being rebuilt because you have also sanctions being imposed by a number of states, which is preventing necessary materials from coming into the country. People argue the sanctions are meant to be on the state and should not be affecting the civilian population, but it really can't be helped. And a Secretary General's report that came out last year was saying even at the level of procurement and payments, these sanctions they're not UN sanctions, they're sanctions imposed by member states, are having an impact, and they need to be reviewed because the civilian population is being affected. But you've seen, I would think, 70% from what we've been looking at and others have reported on of the hospitals have been destroyed. You've had an exodus of medical staff. You've seen also the economy plummeting, impacted also by the sanctions, but also the economy is now at a point where I think, people are leaving the country because they don't see a future in Syria. The European Union was, I think, reporting on an increase in the number of Syrians now reaching Europe than in previous years. People are voting with their feet. They're leaving the country. There's been a 22% decrease in the number of the very small number of Syrians who are returning, because people obviously have the option to go back. But when surveyed by UNHCR, the refugees agency, many have said, we worry about the security, we worry about arrests, detention, torture, disappearances, etc. But the main thing we worry about is, what do we go back to? There may not be a home, there's no job, there's no livelihood, the economy is in ruins. So what are we going back to? So in a way, many would say they want to go back to their country, but they fear right now it's not the time to do that. And the more the years go by, the more they look to then move the other way and move to Europe from the neighboring countries.
And Jordan, of course, is the country where there are huge numbers of displaced people. We've all seen, you and I have seen these pictures of the Zatari refugee camp, this enormous camp with, around 800,000 people. It's quite hard to believe. And then there are people displaced within the country. We have had quite a few reports over the last few days of the situation in the Hol and the Roj camps.
Right.
So I'd like to explain a little bit more about the situation here, because we're hearing that ISIL actually control certain aspects of life in these camps. And there also seems to be no real distinction between people who are ISIL sympathizers and people who have been suffering from ISIL. So, yes, you could explain a bit more.
Right,
Some people call it a mini-state in Al-Hol.
Yeah. I mean, in essence, what's happened is that after the military defeat of the Islamic State, although, as I've been saying, they're starting to come back again, the authorities in that region, the Syrian Democratic Forces, basically took into detention around 9,000 men that were considered to be either fighters or had connections with the Islamic State, and put their families into these camps, the most famous being Al-Hol, but also Al-Roj. And at one point, I think it was over 70,000. The number is now 47,000. It's come down, but it really hasn't come down that much. And in essence, they're in legal limbo. They were supposed to be there to be vetted to see, what their relationship is with the men and with the Islamic State as such. But beyond, some effort to do that, they're kept in these camps that are really like prisons because they can't leave. It's not a refugee camp. It's a camp that's guarded from the outside. And for a long time, they were not going inside because it was a very hostile environment, which allowed some of the more extremist elements within the camps, mainly women and children, to sort of take control. And that created problems with violence, with killings, with attacks on those who may not necessarily have been as extremist in their beliefs, etc. And you have children living. I mean, at the moment we have, I think the number is down to 30,000 children living in those camps under these conditions. In terms of medical facilities, you have, non-governmental organizations trying to bring in help, outside the camps, but also a few clinics inside. But it's really not, as everyone who's visited, I haven't myself because we're not allowed inside Syria by the state, but others who've gone have said it's the worst conditions that they've seen, having visited also other camps and detention.
And these 30,000 children are also in this limbo. They don't know when, if they'll
Exactly,
ever leave.
exactly. What's been happening is the state, in the Turkish authorities, initially were moving children that had reached, puberty, because they considered them to perhaps now have reached fighting age or be a risk to others in the camp. They had been moving them out and putting them with the men in the prisons, which was not a great idea if you're trying to avoid radicalizing young people. You put them in with alleged and suspected fighters, etc. And a fuss was raised by many at the time. They've now started establishing rehabilitation centers where they're putting those children in. But again, consider yourself in your teens. You're removed from your mother. You're not allowed to have access or meet with her or talk to her. You're put in a rehabilitation center, and you have no idea what happens next. And when you reach 18, they may move you to a prison with adults that are considered fighters or supporters of the Islamic State. So it's really not a solution, and it's actually creating a problem which will come back to haunt us.
In terms of being a breeding ground for
exactly, and as I
fighters.
say, the Islamic State is growing again, and perhaps as we've seen now in what's happened in Russia, that they're getting emboldened once again to follow the path they were following before.
Now, you've been cataloguing the suffering of Syrians for many years, since I think around 2017. From everything you've seen, from the evolution of what's happening there, is there any hope for Syria?
At some point you have to think part of the problem is the involvement of the international community in Syria and the 6 armies that are there. And if everybody really left, the Syrians would likely sort the problems out themselves, because the outside interference is not bringing solutions. It's really prolonging the situation, and it's creating a stalemate and a never-ending cycle of violence. Having said that, I think the Syrians have shown they're very resilient. It's amazing the Syrians who have left the country, what they've managed to do abroad, and you're probably aware, they played a big role in establishing this institution that's been looking at accountability and moving cases within courts outside Syria, universal jurisdiction cases, over 50 convictions outside the country. And most recently, they've also pushed the UN to, through a resolution at the General Assembly, to establish another international institution focused on the missing and disappeared in Syria, where we have, I think, at least 100,000 that the relatives would like to know what's happened to them. Many, taken into custody and disappeared, but of course many may have died in other aspects of the conflict, or nobody knows what's happened to them. One of the key problems in Syria is the state is not very open about who it's holding. So in essence, if you don't know if a person is alive and in detention, they're listed as disappeared or missing. So one key first step maybe is to convince the state, but it's also something, sadly, that's replicated by other groups. Holding people incommunicado with no access in conditions that are conducive to torture and ill treatment and deaths in custody and all of that.
Now, you've recently released the report. What's the next step for the Commission?
Well, we're trying to say to the world, don't forget about Syria, because with all these other crises that genuinely, of course, require attention, Syria risks being left behind at a point where we're seeing violence is back on the increase. As we described in the report and I was saying earlier, we're seeing the Islamic State back on the rise, on the horizon. We're seeing a weakened state that's essentially losing control, even though it controls more territory. It's clear, there's a lack of rule of law. It's delegating to non-state actors, authorities to control parts of the country. And the violence is back up, and the aerial attacks and the bombardments. And as you said right at the beginning, over 90% of the population below the poverty level. So Syria needs help now, international assistance now, and above all, it really needs a ceasefire now.
Well, Mr. Megally, thank you so much for coming to the studio today.
Thank you so much.